Nadine Gordimer's first novel, The Lying Days, which was published in 1953, was a product of the resurgence of South African literature after the end of the Second World War. As far as the mood of this novel is concerned, it is much similar to that of Another Woman, Too Late. Here, Nadine Gordimer deals at length with the problems which the change of government in 1948 posed for South African liberals. In fact, she examines through the life of her heroine, Helen, the direction in which South Africa began to move after the nationalist victory. Helen is repeatedly confronted with the question, "Why are you going?" Her search, her quest for an answer has ramifications for the whole of our society. A way out is proposed when Helen, in her continued rebellion against the influence of racialism, finally decides to choose a life of exile for herself. As we begin with the novel, The Lying Days, we find that it is divided into three specific parts: Part 1, Part 2, and Part 3. So let's begin with the opening section of the novel, which is titled as The Mine, which immediately tells the readers that it is entirely dedicated to the life of the miners in the Atherton gold mine. As we begin with the novel, we find that it opens with an act of defiance by the protagonist, Helen, since she refuses to accompany her parents to visit the tennis court, and therefore she is asked to stay indoors by her mother because she is quite apprehensive about the native people, because they appear to be very, very mysterious to them, since they are unable to understand the language of the native people and they hardly interact or communicate with them. It is quite natural on the part of the white middle-class people that they are quite apprehensive about them, and this is how they have designed their life so that they are not required to communicate much with the native black people. As the novel begins with an act of defiance by Helen, we find her visiting the veld on this Saturday afternoon all alone for the first time and observing the lifestyle of the miners of Atherton for the first time. As she pays her visit to the veld, she is immediately able to perceive the difference in the living conditions of the white and the black community. Not only that, she is also able to perceive the difference in the treatment of children, because she, as a member of the white community, is overindulgently protected by her mother, while she finds that the little young children are left totally with their nurses to take care of them, while their mothers are engaged in their own activities and involving in gossips at the same time. After her visit to the veld, Helen is able to distinguish between the European life of ecstasy and the reality of African life. And here at this point, she makes a very, very important statement where she says that whatever books she had read so far have never really interested her because she could never find herself, her life in those books. Those books were filled with fantasy, while the life she lives in Atherton is completely different. And as she perceives the African life, she feels that in neither of these books the life of people like Anna is described. And that is why these books have never really interested her, because she could never find herself in those books. It was a world completely unseen, unknown to her. Apart from this, as she walks the veld, her interest in the life of the native people gradually grows. She also finds that the environment which envelops the native life is dirty, foul, and unhygienic. When she finds these native people, she could feel that they are so innocent and their lively nature gets reflected in their immaterialistic approach towards life, which immediately stands in stark contrast with the life of the white community, which is dedicated to parties, enjoying parties, visiting the tennis courts, playing golf. However, after her visit to the veld is over, Helen goes to the tennis court where her parents are already there, and she has this sense of belongingness because she is finally in an environment which is known to her. But it should be noted that while she finds herself as one in her own environment, she also enjoys being lonely in that unfamiliar world surrounding the veld. As readers, we could also see the difference in the structure of the houses belonging to different communities, underlining at the same time the difference in their lifestyle and their status in the society. The engagements of the white middle class people are also described by the novelist here, and another character is introduced. Anna, a member of the black community who serves the Shaws for a long time. And her place in the household of her white master is also made very clear. Though Anna has been serving the Shaws for a long time, and now she receives the same treatment which is given to a member of the white community, yet she is not allowed to live inside the house. And at the same time, we see the effect of the harshness of reality on Anna. Because her physical feature, the way her thin black legs are described by the novelist and compared to that of Mrs. Shaw's legs, immediately shows that their life is so full of hard labor. As far as the little African boys are concerned, they are found everywhere, be it the bus station, the railway station, everywhere. And they are found to adopt several means to earn their livelihood. They are found to sell newspapers as well. Here, it is to be noted that the newspaper acts as an instrument of injecting racial discrimination, because generally in the Atherton gold mine hardly accidents occur. But if there is any, and if it concerns any white man, then it is highlighted in the newspaper, giving full details about that individual. While if the same happens to a black native, then it is simply published in the newspaper as a generalized news. People who work in the underground of the mine, they seem to have an advantage over the ones who generally don't visit the underground and who do not work there. And Helen's father is one such man who doesn't enjoy this advantage, which is employing the black native boys to work in their garden. As Helen becomes 11 years old, she becomes a part of the superficial life of her own community. And the way Mrs. Ocker's party is described, it reflects the superficiality, the artificiality of the society they live in. As I mentioned about the black native boys, they are made to work at the garden by their bosses. Who are these bosses? People who work in the underground. And here it is in Mrs. Ocker's party that for the first time Helen gets acquainted with the word strike and its underlying significance, because her father, while talking to one of their neighbors, talks about this strike and says that even if someone does not work, even when someone does not work, it is a strike. But when people even refuse to eat, that is also another form of a strike. And this knowledge is gained by Helen for the first time. Helen reaches the adolescent stage and she becomes 16 years old. And gradually, realization dawns upon her related to her mother's life and what life actually meant to her. Because she found that her mother's life revolved around her, the household, and her parties. This is what life meant to her. This was her entire world. Her father has not been able to offer voluntary service to the army because he suffered from ulcer ailments. And then we come to know the several books that Helen Shaw has read by Captain Marryat, Jane Austen, Omar Khayyam, Rupert Brooke. Since Mrs. Shaw was a member of the library. She used to bring these books home, and Helen used to read those books. By this time, matriculation examination is completed by Helen, and she gets a new experience at the parties with young boys who pay much attention to her. And gradually, at this adolescent stage, there is a growing curiosity in her regarding the physical body. And at the same time, she has this feeling of stiffness while she's out with these young boys. In spite of being curious about these boys, their physical structure, yet she is not able to find herself in a comfort zone amidst them. It is during this period that Helen is also taught golf by her father, and she has to visit the clubhouse where she has this sense of feeling out of place in the clubhouse amidst the mine officials, because they seem to discuss things which do not interest her at all, which makes her feel so out of place. Moving to the part 2 of the novel, which is titled The Sea, again tells the readers that it is going to focus totally on the sea. In part 2, we find Helen reaching 17 years, and for the first time, she is allowed by her mother to pay a visit to Mrs. Alice Coates' house, an old friend of her mother who lives in Johannesburg. After completing her matriculation, however, Helen spends a year working at a temporary job in her father's office. And when she reaches 17 years, she visits Johannesburg all alone. Mrs. Coach is found to be very affectionate and easy to talk to by Helen. In fact, she feels that she is very, very accessible, and she makes her feel so comfortable and so easy to talk to, which nobody in her life has made her feel so long. And this underlines and makes her realize the distance that exists between her and her parents. Because she begins to like Mrs. Coach because of her accessible, easygoing nature. It is in this chapter, or in this part of the novel, a very significant character, or we can say one of those significant characters who are going to influence Helen's life is introduced. Ludi, Mrs. Coates' son. He is a soldier on leave for the time being and is so very fond of fishing that no matter how the weather is, he would simply go to the beach in order to fish. Ludi's attachment with Mrs. Coach is clearly reflected the way She, as a mother, provided him with the mental support in whatever he did in his life. It appears from their life they are not at all materialistic like the Shaws. They have an entirely different world of their own. And they are much comfortable and happy with that. As the novel proceeds, we find that Ludi, Mrs. Coach, and Helen as well, frequently visit the beach, and there Helen experiences the beauty of the sea. And whenever all of them are together in the family, she gets this sense of familiarity. Because whether it's Ludi or Mrs. Coach, they always make her feel home, so very comfortable that she immediately finds herself in a familiar world. As far as Ludi's character is concerned, his lack of interest in the human exterior and his admiration for the impersonal nature and its beauty these are some qualities which attract Helen towards him. In fact, Ludi's view about the mine life at Atherton is expressed by him blatantly before Helen, where he says that he could never think of such a life which is so very mechanical, narrowest, a kind of unrewarding existence. Though she feels attracted towards Ludi because of his outlook on life, because of a kind of existence which she finds to be so strange, but she finds it shameful at the same time, because Helen feels that in her community nobody could think of fishing around, nobody could think of living life without doing work. So the kind of life which Ludi embraces appears not only strange to Helen, but shameful at the same time, though she realizes that she is the one who has been a part of this world so long. Helen's reaction towards Ludi's materialistic attitude to life attracts her more and more towards him. And she realizes that he is someone who abides by some other law. He doesn't follow the law dictated by the world. In fact, Ludi makes Helen see a different world of which she has no clue at all, and therefore she finds it very, very attractive and a complete departure, something completely different from her own way of life. However, it should be remembered that there is an age gap of 10 years between Ludi and Helen, but it becomes completely redundant when it comes to their coming close to each other, being physically intimate. Since we all know that Ludi is a soldier and he has been on leave, so his departure leads to Helen's loneliness because now she has become fond of him, which leads to her growing expectations. But the sudden return of Ludi makes her tremble, and it also takes Mrs. Koch by surprise. Although Ludi was about to leave, yet the breaking of the bridge did hamper his joining the service, and therefore he had to come back. And then the consequent visit to the beach together. Helen gets gradually attracted towards Ludi, and for the first time she explores her feeling of sexuality. She gets physically intimate with Ludi on the beach, and as an adolescent, she gets intoxicated after being kissed by Ludi. Because Ludi is the first man in her life who provided her with the first delights of love. And in fact, this very experience makes her cling to it, considering it to be a precious one. Because for the first time, Helen discovers love. And she realizes that love means warmth. The candidness of the relationship between Mrs. Koch and Ludi becomes very clear when she teases her son regarding his taking another holiday. And then there is another instance of their physical intimacy between Ludi and Helen. And Helen puts in much effort to feel and retain within her the reality of the situation. She does not want to get rid of it. Rather, she wishes to cherish the memory of her intimacy with Ludi. And there is also an instance where we find that as an adolescent, she feels envious of another woman who had given some socks to Ludi, and she immediately goes and inquires Ludi about that. And she also feels restless to be close to Ludi. And in another instance, when there is nobody in the house, Mrs. Koch was not there because she went to attend some parties, maybe a wedding party. We find that there is a strange attitude in Ludi, which surprised Helen as well. Though both of them were close to each other, yet there was this sudden indifference that emerged in Ludi that makes Helen realize or comprehend the transient or the temporary nature of life, more specifically relationships. And here Ludi says that this had happened to him earlier as well. He comes close to some woman, and that woman, when she begins to be interested in him, he, as a man, loses all interest and begins to avoid. So this is something very new to Helen. And after this new realization on the part of Helen did not make her lose herself again. Let's be very specific with this. When Helen came close to Ludi for the first time, she got attracted towards him and she began to feel restless to be close to him. But having seen this indifference on his part and realizing the impermanence of everything, she has this immense realization that it is the capacity or the capability of her own body that helped her experience such a thing while being intimate with Ludi. And this would always remain with her, no matter how Ludi behaves. It would not make her lose herself again. Because this is her own body, her own feeling of sexuality, which would always remain with her, even if Ludi is not there. After she returns to Atherton from Jonas Park, she finds her own home unknown and meaningless after having visited or experienced Ludi's world. And what she does gradually is she creates a world of her own, inhabiting Ludi with her own self, which is her secret world that made her exclude everything around her. She didn't even want to visit her friend. She did not even want to go to any party. Rather, wanted to remain confined within her secret world, inhabited by Ludi and her own self. It is in this chapter we find that Helen's relationship with her father is more comfortable than with Mrs. Shaw, because Mr. Shaw has a more understanding nature that makes him very much accessible to his daughter. And when the question emerges regarding her admission in the university, she declines to visit the university. While Mrs. Shaw gets shocked by her decision because she wants her daughter to embrace this materialistic world that demands her to be someone to fit well in it. While Helen's father's view about education and success in life is something else. According to him, it is not necessary for everyone to go to the university and educate themselves in order to be happy or successful in life. Rather, one should always pursue things in life which they are fond of, because it would ultimately lead to their happiness and success. And when, after having her decision, of not going to the university, Mrs. Shaw proposes that then in that case she must become a librarian. Immediately, the objection is raised by her father because he feels that it's no job at all. And Helen's decision of not going to the university makes the readers feel that she has simply embraced the world of Ludi, and that's why she wants to live by the laws of freedom laid down by Ludi. In fact, Ludi's influence upon Helen is such that from now on, whatever she does, whatever steps she takes, the first thing that comes to her mind is how Ludi would accept her decision, or how Ludi would look upon her decision. What impression would he form about her? And then she receives a letter from Ludi where he expresses his appreciation of her kind and gentle behavior towards his mother. And he mentions nothing else related to their relationship. And as an adolescent, we find Helen in a state where she's not only exalted, where we not only see her exaltation having received the letter, but at the same time, she suffers from confused feelings. As I said, that she has already created a world of her own where Ludi may not be physically present, but even his absence did not make any difference. She began to live his way of life and always became aware about what Ludi would think. She seemed to create this another life for herself. Gradually, Helen realizes that their life on this Atherton gold mine is actually empty and hollow because it does not have a tradition of art and music of their own culture, unlike the Europeans. She feels that this is the place which would not lead to one's prosperity in life. And here, Nadine Gordimer depicts the true picture of South Africa. And now, since Helen is not in touch or does not communicate with Ludi, he is not there in her life any longer. Gradually, she becomes aware of the potentialities or the capacities of her own body for the first time. Because she realizes that it is her body that is capable of receiving the pleasure, which helps her gain knowledge about the power, capacity, capability of her own real body. And then suddenly, one day we find her impulsively going to the university and taking admission there. And now begins her life at the university. And it is at this particular place where Helen realizes that it is really difficult to be equal in an unequal society. Because The society is structured in a way which deliberately discriminates between one and the other on the basis of race or color. So no matter how much she strives to be equal, it is something unachievable. And here, the relationship between the races in her society is examined by Gordimer. It is at the university where Helen meets Mary Seswayo for the first time. And we must remember that this university where Helen has taken admission is one of those few places where racial discrimination is not practiced in South Africa. Because Mary Seswayo, being a member of the Black community, is not allowed to use the same cloakroom used by the members of the white community. And that's why when in the cloakroom she encounters Helen for the first time, she's afraid that she might be asked to leave or something offensive might be said by the member of the white community. And while describing this incident and the relationship between Mary Seswayo and Helen, Nadine Gordimer makes it very clear that no matter how much ethical or principled an individual is, it can never actually compensate for the inadequacies or the deficiencies that are already existing in the society. Because the one who would try to rebel against the established conventions, society would impose other inequalities upon that person, making his or her life vulnerable. In fact, Helen's failure to befriend Mary Seswayo at the university reflects that a society which is completely opposed to liberalism or a liberal way of life would never help develop such a decent, true friendship between two people belonging to two different communities, just because one is a member of the white community and the other is a member of the black community. The society is prejudiced to such an extent that it would never allow a rebel like Helen Shaw to go on with her liberal attitude to life. And gradually, through her several experiences at the university, Helen realizes that people like her seem to have two births. Why? Because her one birth or her first birth has been the one which made her live a cocooned life in the mine compound, living amidst the white middle class people, embracing their principles, their laws of the world, their own laws of their own world. While her second birth is the one where she is able to break free herself from all the established taboos in the society and overcome the racial barrier. It is Only by overcoming the social taboos and the racial barrier that this rebirth is possible. Otherwise, one would always remain confined to his or her confined life. Since she has taken admission to the university, she gets acquainted with another man in her life, Joel Aaron, whom she meets while traveling by the train to Johannesburg. And she finds that Joel Aaron is someone who makes the other person feel very, very comfortable in his presence. Their friendship develops, and they also go to parties, visit several places with each other. Yet, their relationship never blossoms into love because Joel Aaron is a Jew. And when Helen's mother comes to know about her friendship with Joel Aaron, she is really shocked to see Helen's taste. And that's why Joel Aaron becomes her guide, introducing her to new ideas, new interests, and new friends. In spite of having feelings for each other, their relationship does not blossom. And Joel, we can level him as Helen's friend, philosopher, and guide, who introduces her to a different world, which she has never been a part of. As she encounters this different world, Helen begins to drift away from her mother in order to make her rebellion a stronger one, because now she becomes matured enough to realize that it is the smugness of their family which is actually responsible for this miserable plight of South Africa. It is her own community which is responsible for this misery of South Africa. And having realized her mother's smugness, she gradually moves away from her, and their relationship becomes more and more strenuous, which leads to much estrangement between Mrs. Shaw and Helen. And Helen seems to have this desperate urge to escape from her home. When we come by the end of this part 2, we find that finally Helen's decision to bring Mary Sessoyo home to help her prepare for her examination for a couple of days under circumstances more comfortable than are possible in the slum, the very place where she lives in, leads to the final explosion between Helen and her mother, and she leaves home. Because after having met Mary Sessoyo, Helen realizes that as a member of the Black community, she has to struggle a lot. She has to encounter several hardships, and the environment or the atmosphere where she dwells is not fit enough for a student to prepare herself for an examination. And therefore, when she comes up with a decision to bring her home it leads to this final explosion, because this would never be accepted by Mrs. Shaw. And this rebellion on the part of Helen makes her finally leave home. And part 2, therefore, ends with Helen's rebellion against her mother's smugness and a society that practices racial discrimination, of which she detests to be a part of. Because now it is a realization that has finally made her a rebel. It is her realization that apart from the world where she was brought up, there is a world which exists where too many questions remain unanswered. Part 3 is completely dedicated to Helen's life in the city of Johannesburg, because now she is no longer in touch with her parents, and having already rebelled against her family, she lands up in the city. And part 3 begins when Helen is in her 3rd academic year and begins to live in Johannesburg with the couple John and Jenny Marcus, to whom she has been introduced by Joel Aaron. It is in this city life that Helen's attachment to a bohemian group takes place. She gets attached to this group, which is associated not only with art and culture, but it is associated with politics and social reform as well. And it is in this bohemian group that she meets Paul Clerk, who is also a member of this group. Paul Clerk is the 3rd man who would pull her, take her out of her smug background and make her experience life as it is at the present situation. It is Paul Clerk's good looks and his version about the good life which fascinate her a lot, that after she gets intimate with him, she decides to dedicate her life to love. Here I would like to point out that the first delights of love, or the discovery of love, took place in Helen's life when she came close or became intimate with Mrs. Scott's son, Ludi. As far as Joel Aaron is concerned, a very good friendship develops between them, and she is introduced to a new world. Where she gets new ideas, where she develops new interests, and her curiosity to gain more and more knowledge to quench her thirst begins with the help of Joel Aaron. And as far as this 3rd man, Paul, is concerned, he is going to simply make her now experience this reality. It is during this time period that the Nationalist Party comes to power. The Nationalist Party, as we all know, which dictated the laws of apartheid, keeping the black people apart, not allowing them to be a part of the public world, discriminating them in every field of their life. And when this Nationalist Party comes to power, Helen gets caught in a mesh of inexplicable forces with little or no insight into the consequence, which implies that despite being a rebellion, when the situation finally emerges, she really cannot decide what to do. She's caught in a kind of dilemma, and she cannot think what this would finally lead to. And therefore, everything appears to her as unreal, whether it has been her mind life or the life at the university. In fact, in spite of being in a relationship with Paul Clerk, she even finds marriage and domestic life futile. This happens to an individual when he or she is in a state of confusion, does not have any clue as to what steps to be taken to ensure a secure future. We all know now by now that she is physically involved with Paul Clerk, but it is her sense of moral responsibility that makes her feel guilty, for now she lives with Paul in his flat without marrying him, but she writes letters to her parents from the Marcus's address, therefore hiding it completely from them. And this makes her relate herself to the Atherton mine, which never really had the moral courage, just like her, to be anything else. Since she is hiding this fact that she is living with Paul in his flat without marrying him, makes her suffer from this guilt, and therefore she feels that no matter how much she has rebelled against her family, still she is unable to have the courage, she is unable to have the moral courage to be what she really wants to be. And therefore she hid the fact from her parents. Gradually, her relationship with Paul gets strained, for he gets more and more involved with his work at the welfare office, where he works for the non-whites. Helen also works at the same welfare office, but then she finds that it is completely useless, futile, for ultimately it fails, this very institution fails to achieve anything practically. All the slogans, all the initiatives that are taken go in vain. And she realizes that this welfare office not only fails to achieve anything practically, but at the same time, it is destroying her relationship with Paul as well. It is destroying her love life as well. As a result, it creates a rift between them. Their relationship becomes more and more mechanical, though they continue with their physical intimacy as a part of their physical need, yet they are found to quarrel and fight in public places. And then she leaves her job and descends into a life of loneliness. She gains the reader's sympathy for being a woman who had the capacity to love someone with everything, but her emotions remain unreciprocated. And here she recalls something told to her by Isa Welsh, who had been in a relationship with Paul before. And she says that with Paul, it is not possible to have a relationship because he's undeserving. And the kind of love, the degree of love that Helen holds in her heart for Paul go unreciprocated. Though she had all the capacity to love him with her everything. Her return to the mine, that very day, she decides to give up on her relationship with Paul, and she returns to the mine where she recalls her moments of childhood. But then she leaves her two homes forever. She decides not to be in these two homes ever. Her home in Atherton and the one in Jonas Park. She decides to end her relationship, and therefore she leaves Jonas Park and arrives in Durban and visits the sea once again to feel her liberating effect. While being before the sea, it makes her realize what impact nature has on one's mind. And there, again, we find her reunion with Joel Aaron, who is about to leave for Israel, his home. And in fact, her reunion with Joel Aaron takes place just a few days before she leaves. And she comes to know that Aaron is going to live for Israel, which is his quote-unquote home. And again, it makes her have the same feeling of her lack of roots anywhere, her lack of identity, her lack of individuality. An individual who fails to find her own roots anywhere in the world. Despite being a part of the Bohemian circle, what she realizes that even this Bohemian circle suffers from hypocrisy. And therefore, she despises not only the smugness of her middle-class background, but the hypocritic world of the Bohemians. Therefore, having experienced so much in these years of her life, Helen finally accepts the fact that all her initiatives at tolerance are bound to face failure. Whichever world he becomes a part of, and no matter how much tolerance she shows, everything is doomed to fail because, as I had mentioned, it is an unequal society where this liberalism of Helen Shaw will not work. And as an adolescent, at present, what she expected of her life is a life with Paul. But then she finds that even that does not work for her. And this makes her decide to choose a life of exile because she realizes that liberalism becomes meaningless in South Africa. A liberal attitude becomes meaningless, futile in a place like South Africa, where there is inequality everywhere, where there is hypocrisy and smugness all around. Thus, in her quest, in her thirst for self-knowledge, to gain more and more knowledge and an effective self of her own, she embraces exile, though it implies a complete loss of one's own self, left with no purpose in life, unlike Joel Arn, who has a home at least, while our protagonist, Helen Shaw, is even deprived of that. So, having chosen a life of exile, she is left with no purpose in her life at all. In fact, her relationship with Paul allows her to have a very transient temporary contact with reality. It was not a very permanent contact with reality, and everything related to her experience with Paul was entirely quote unquote private for her because she even failed to complete her university education, and she longed for this private life with Paul so much that even the incident of her leaving the university without a degree appears to be very, very trivial to her compared to her desire to have a private life with her lover. So, no matter how much rebellious Helen Shaw is, as an adolescent, at this stage of her life, she longed, she pined for a private love life with her lover, Paul. But her subsequent dilemma related to an intolerable present and unimaginable future with Paul finally makes her choose a life of exile because she could realize that her life with Paul at present was something she couldn't bear anymore, and even she couldn't see a secure future with Paul. Very carefully, so we can see that she divided her private life from the public life, which she failed to enter. And that's why she gave up her job at the welfare office. Hence, when we come to the end of the novel, we find Helen Shaw emerging as a woman who does not despair, who does not repent, rather considers her mistakes, her past mistakes in life, to be a blessing in disguise, and looks upon her present disillusionment as the beginning of a new life. Because as readers we saw that Helen Shaw has been a part of different worlds. And as days passed by, she became disillusioned with each and every world. But she does not look upon this experience of hers as something unaccepted, because she feels that this disillusionment has given her the opportunity to begin a new life. As a reader, we look upon Helen as a nonconformist. Of course, she has been a nonconformist since she denied to abide by the laws which rule the world and embraced her own liberal ideas. She plunges into a different world every time to gain knowledge and realizes where she actually stands, which finally leads her to accept her defeat to be a part of any of these worlds as an act of abandonment, though she never regrets it, that she had been a failure to have her own world, to have a world which would be dictated by the laws of liberalism. In fact, we find that whatever life she opts for becomes unsuccessful. And as it becomes unsuccessful, be it her life as an arts undergraduate or as a member of the Bohemian Circle of Artists and Intellectuals, finally, her failure to attain success does not make her descend into despair. What she is finally deprived of is having a personal mode of experience. Because being a part of a world which perceives, which sees everything, which judges everything in the light of established social conventions pertaining to class and race, does not let her have a personal mode of experience. In an environment where the laws of appetite regulate everything, such idealism and liberalism can never exist. And this is the stark truth, realized and experienced by Helen Shaw at the cost of her own life. It is her eventual feeling of being disconnected with her own country, because she realizes she neither belongs to her own country nor to any other place. Her own country where she took birth. She felt so disconnected that it made her embrace exile, which we might compare to the deaths of many Victorian women protagonists who, having failed to find any solution to their internal contradictions, ended their life. But here we find Helen Shaw as a character praiseworthy because she is courageous enough to make a new beginning for herself, even if it is a life of exile. But it is applaudable that she did not put an end to her own life, even after having faced failure so many times.